Hello, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles. Episode 1.7, Writing the Pentateuch. In episode 1.3, I talked about how Johann Salomo Semler founded what we now call the historical criticism of the Bible, sometimes also known as higher criticism. This discipline is dedicated to unravelling the origins of the many biblical texts, to understanding how the history of the Israelites drove the formation of the Bible. For some devout Christians and Jews, the entire enterprise is deeply suspect, if not outrageous. Moses wrote the Torah, or the Pentateuch, the prophet Jeremiah wrote the book of the same name, and so on. What is there to study? Semler thought that there were many problems, and so did Julius Wellhausen, a Christian German theologian who wrote his most influential works in the last quarter of the 19th century. Although his theories have been modified and attacked, reformulated and repudiated, Wellhausen's ideas still permeate all of biblical scholarship a century after his death. Even if you disagree with every word he said, you are nonetheless compelled to engage with his arguments. Wellhausen tackled the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. Wellhausen felt that there were so many inconsistencies and duplications in the biblical texts that it was inconceivable that a single author was behind them. There are 3 versions of the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, Exodus 34, and Deuteronomy 5. There are 2 creation stories, 2 stories of the flood, to name but many. He formulated what is now known as the documentary hypothesis, which argued that 4 great traditions or schools had contributed to those books. Not one single author, Moses, but 4 independent narratives that were later combined into the books we have today. Each author retold many of the same stories from their own point of view. These narratives became known by letters, J, E, P, and D. They can be found mixed together throughout the entire Torah. The J source was so named because it uses Yahweh as the name of God. Wellhausen identified its source as the southern kingdom of Judah. The first story in the Bible from J is Genesis 2:4. Quote, "This is the account of heaven and earth when they were created, at the time when Yahweh Elohim made earth and heaven. Wild bushes and plants were not on the earth yet, because Yahweh Elohim hadn't sent rain on the earth. And there was no human to till the soil. Instead, underground water would come up from the earth and water the entire surface of the ground. Then Yahweh Elohim formed the human from the dust of the earth and blew the breath of life into his nostrils. The human became a living being." This is the first passage in the Bible that uses God's personal name, Yahweh. In the J source, God is a character who walks with Adam and Eve, eats with Abraham, and even bargains. He is a very human figure. J's God is someone you can negotiate with. In Genesis 18, for example, God suddenly and inexplicably decides to annihilate Sodom and Gomorrah. He muses, quote, "Now Yahweh had said, 'Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him?' Then Yahweh said, 'The outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grave. I will go down to see whether they have acted altogether according to the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will take note.' Abraham came forward and said, 'Will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? What if there should be 50 innocent within the city? Will you then wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the innocent 50 who are in it?' And Yahweh answered, 'If I find within the city of Sodom 50 innocent ones, I will forgive the whole place for their sake.'" End quote. Abraham eventually bargains God right down. Quote, Genesis 18:32. "And Abraham said, 'Let not Adonai be angry if I speak but this last time. What if 10 should be found there?' And he answered, 'I will not destroy for the sake of the 10. End quote. In J, God is your lovable but cranky grandpa of a shotgun. He can be dangerous and arbitrary, but if you can calm him down for a few minutes, he can be reasoned with. J provides most of the stories of the patriarchs and the first half of Exodus. The core of J's theology is the divine promise to Abraham. One notable story not known to J is that of the sacrifice of Isaac. J favours Judah, supporting it against the northern tribes. J focuses on humanity's relationship to the land, its increasing corruption, as in the flood story, and the boundaries between human and divine. In J, the holy mountain is called Sinai. The natives of Palestine are called Canaanites. Moses' father-in-law is known as Ruel or Hovav, and the third patriarch is invariably called Israel. In the second major source, E, the holy mountain is called Horeb. The natives of Palestine are called Amorites. Moses' father-in-law is known as Jethro, and the third patriarch is invariably called Jacob. The E source always calls God El or Elohim. E has no stories of the creation, nothing before Abraham. Where J has some interest in all of humanity, E's God El only sees the people of Israel. El never talks to the people directly, let alone have lunch with them. El communicates through visions, or through divine messengers or natural phenomena, in clouds and flames and thunder. E's God is dangerous and terrifying. The E source, said Wellhausen, originated in the northern kingdom of Israel, and so E favours Joshua and Joseph, heroes from the northern tribes. Where J looks on Abraham's covenant with God as the foundation of Israel, E is convinced that the covenant made with Moses is the central event in Jewish history. On the other hand, E never has a good word to say about Moses' brother Aaron, the ancestor of the southern kingdom's priesthood. The third major source Wellhausen identified came to be known as P, the priestly source. Wellhausen dated E and J to the heydays of the two kingdoms, call it 850 BC. But to P he attributed a very late date, during the exile in Babylon 300 years later. P provides the very first words of the Bible, quote, Genesis 1:1. When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, Let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was a morning, a first day. End quote. Wellhausen thought that P is the text that the priests wrote while they waited by the rivers of Babylon. All the many genealogies and tribal lists in the Torah, chapters and chapters of them, are the work of P. If you've never noticed just how much of the first 5 books of the Bible are devoted to genealogies, stop taking those sleeping pills and start reading some of those long passages at bedtime. If, as Wellhausen thought, the P source was only written down during the exile, its oral roots go back a further 500 years to the foundation of Solomon's temple. P is insistent that it's all about priests, it's all about the temple, and it's all about sacrifices. In P, there are no angels, no dreams, no prophets. The only way to be blessed by God is through a priest to the temple, and hey, the only way we will even talk to you is if you bring a gift. The P source has a thing about the defiling nature of corpses, bones, and the grave. This preoccupation stands out in contrast to the surrounding Canaanite cultures. It may be a reflection of an attempt to combat a cult of the dead. It would have been in the priesthood's interest to suppress these cults, which did not require a priest and brought no income to the temple. P promotes precisely the opposite idea. The only legitimate avenue to the deity is through the priests. P is the author behind all the rules of Leviticus and most of the rules in Numbers. He also wrote the elaborate descriptions of the tabernacle that occupy almost a third of Exodus. To P, the elaborate rituals of sacrifice, which I will discuss later, define everything. God demands blood sacrifice, and blood sacrifice shall you give. To P, Judaism is a religion of seeing, not hearing, and of smelling the sweet savour of incense and spices that ascend to heaven to please God. P's religion is physical, in which language, even prayer, plays little role. P never explains the theology behind his thinking. Do as the priests command you to do. You need know nothing more. The fourth and final source Wellhausen identified was the author of the book of Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomist or the D source. Deuteronomy is the last book of the Torah. In the 1940s, 60 years after Wellhausen wrote, the German scholar Martin Noth argued that the Deuteronomist was also the source behind the great histories of Israel, told in the books that follow Deuteronomy: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. He called them the Deuteronomistic history. In that theory, the book of Deuteronomy was unrelated to the books preceding it in the Pentateuch. It was instead a link between the stories of Israel in the wilderness, told in the book of Numbers, and the rest of Israel's history. D insists that the Jews must worship only Yahweh, but it is not clear if the existence of other gods is denied. D also insists that this worship can only rightfully occur at Jerusalem, and that only the line of David can rule over the Israelites. D describes a cyclic view of history, in which the Jews alternate between fidelity and apostasy to Yahweh. When they are faithful to the covenant, all is well. When not, only death and destruction can follow. The D author is widely regarded as the instigator of an infamous incident in 622 BC, in the reign of King Josiah, Yoshiyahu of Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel had been annihilated by the Assyrians a century before. Josiah was leading a revival of what could be called the Yahweh-only party. Long quote, 2 Kings 22:8. Then the high priest Hilkiyahu said to the scribe Shaphan, I have found a scroll of the teaching in the house of Yahweh. And Hilkiyahu gave the scroll to Shaphan, who read it. The scribe Shaphan also told the king, The high priest Hilkiyahu has given me a scroll. And Shaphan read it to the king. When the king heard the words of the scroll of the teaching, he rent his clothes. And the king gave orders to the priest Hilkiyahu, Go, inquire of Yahweh on my behalf, and on behalf of the people, and on behalf of all Judah concerning the words of this scroll that has been found. For great indeed must be the wrath of Yahweh that has been kindled against us, because our fathers did not obey the words of this scroll to do all that has been prescribed for us. At the king's summons, all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem assembled before him. The king went up to the house of Yahweh, together with all the men of Judah, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the priests and prophets, all the people, young and old. And he read to them the entire text of the covenant scroll which had been found in the house of Yahweh. The king stood by the pillar and solemnized the covenant before Yahweh, that they would follow Yahweh and observe his commandments, his injunctions, and his laws with all their heart and soul, that they would fulfill all the terms of this covenant as inscribed upon the scroll, and all the people entered into the covenant. End quote. This scroll is usually identified as the book of Deuteronomy itself. To explain how the author of D could continue to write for another few decades to complete the history related in the books of Kings, scholars postulated a Deuteronomistic school of writers. For most of the 20th century, Wellhausen's ideas formed the basic framework of biblical scholarship. This framework held that the core books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch and the Histories, or the Torah and the former prophets, were the result of centuries of writing and editing that only finished after the exile in Babylon. 4 schools or sources contributed to all these books, J, E, P, and D, each with different aims and agendas. The E source developed in Israel and was brought to the southern kingdom of Judah after the fall of the kingdom. There it was combined with a native J source by an unknown editor. Somewhere along the way, the P source added a mass of material, possibly as a rejoinder to the stories in J and E, which P considered irreverent. Most scholars thought that the P school worked in the exilic period, around 550 BC. Others thought it originated 170 years earlier, during the reign of King Hezekiah, Hizkiyahu of Judah, who lived to witness in dismay the destruction of Israel. The D source was thrown into the mix during the time of Hezekiah's grandson Josiah. Whatever the case, the books we know as the Pentateuch and the histories were only finally assembled after the Jews returned to the province of Judah during the Persian period. The leader after the return, Ezra, was often mentioned by scholars as the final editor, the man who pulled together all the stories from all the sources into the collection we have today. Whoever the compiler was, he was not afraid of redundancies and repetitions. He kept contradictions because he did not like destroying evidence, and multiple reports provide an aura of authenticity. Many Jewish intellectuals were mortified and appalled at the biblical criticism exemplified by Wellhausen's theories. Any critique, any questioning of the core text of Judaism, the Torah, was an insult to God, a blasphemy. Jews also resented the triumphalist tone of Christian criticism and its apparent anti-Semitism. Johann Semler himself had said that the Old Testament must be rid of its coarse Jewish prejudices. Jewish scholars did not even consider the methods of historical criticism until after the Second World War. Most conservative Protestant Christian intellectuals ignored biblical criticism entirely. The great biblical scholar William Albright, the man who utterly dominated biblical studies until his death in 1971, believed that the patriarchs are real people, or at least believable composite characters. A good evangelical Christian, Albright was irked by the biblical criticism of the 19th century, which he felt denied the Bible's truths. He distrusted the theories of Wellhausen and was boundlessly optimistic about archaeology's contribution to biblical interpretation. His archaeological work, moreover, seemed to confirm that even if Genesis and Exodus were only given their final form in the exile, or even later, these books were still firmly grounded in reality. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph had lived and died in the Middle Bronze Age, sometime in the centuries before 1500 BC. But by 1980, biblical criticism was a mundane part of the curriculum in Catholic seminaries and in the more liberal Protestant and Jewish theological schools. The two main Bibles I use, the Catholic New American Bible and the Jewish Study Bible, incorporate its insights into their commentaries as a matter of course. But if the documentary hypothesis and the whole idea of historical criticism was a standard subject in theological training, it was utterly unknown to the laity. If by 1980 Wellhausen's theories had become the academic consensus, that consensus was falling apart by the year 2000. Not that the documentary hypothesis is today considered to be complete rubbish. On the contrary, it is still extremely influential, still provides the terminology and framework for newer ideas, and is still the grand theory that young scholars must grapple with before they come up with their own rebuttals. Critics took issue with Wellhausen's central idea that the Torah was a compilation of originally separate but complete and coherent works. Wellhausen had assumed that two versions of a single story must mean two authors. But why, said the critics, assume that each separate author wrote but a single version of each story, yet also accept that the final editor had no qualms about including multiple versions? To them it made no sense and only complicated matters. Especially troublesome was the E-source, which became difficult to disentangle from J and seemed to disappear somewhere in the last half of Exodus. What everyone still agrees on, though, is the identity of P and D. They have distinct technical language and theology. Some scholars see the Torah as evolving around a diverse group of traditions, growing and changing through time. At some point, these oral traditions were supplemented by D and later by P. These critics discard the notions of J and E entirely. Others think that the Deuteronomistic tradition is the heart of the early books of the Bible, and that sometime during the Persian period, more family-friendly writers added the J and E portions. Heated arguments are waged about when the final editing was carried out, perhaps by Ezra in the Persian period, or even as late as the Hasmonean kingdom, that last brief flourish of Jewish independence before they were squashed by the Romans. There has been somewhat of a revival of the documentary hypothesis in the last decade. The old hypothesis used stylistic and terminological marks to divide the text. The new version says these are secondary criteria. Instead, plot and narrative continuity are the key markers. An author is defined by his creation of and adherence to a distinct set of narrative claims: who did what, when, where, and how. Moreover, it is a purely literary question. The dating of the sources is not a topic of investigation. The only possibility is relative dating, and that in only one case. D was written after E and J. The new version has nothing to say about the dating of J, E, or P. The old hypothesis was often concerned with identifying the strata in the various sources. The new synthesis is only concerned with the penultimate form of the text, what the final compiler had at hand when he put the 4 documents together. Well, finally, after 6 episodes, we can start our tour of the books of the Bible. We begin at the beginning, with Genesis, chapter 1, verse 1. But hang on. Where did these chapters and verses come from? The Hebrew text has no chapters or verses. It is divided into books and then into parashot, what we would call paragraphs. These paragraphs are no more numbered than the paragraphs in the Agatha Christie's on your bookshelf are. The 5 books of Moses, the Torah, are divided into 54 larger sections called parashot Ashavua, one for each weekly reading of the year, with allowances for leap years. Each of these sections has a name based on a prominent opening phrase, but in each section there are only the unnumbered paragraphs. The other books of the Tanakh don't even have these sections. The Christians dropped even the paragraph system. For both Jews and Christians, there was no way for centuries to accurately pinpoint a section of the Bible. Only scholars who had a sound understanding of the whole Bible could identify and locate specific passages. They had secret knowledge denied to any of their laity. It was a powerful tool that could be used to silence questioning by throwing doubt on the questioner's reading. Which passage did you mean? Surely not that one. You must be mistaken. The first person to divide the Bible into chapters was probably Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, during the reign of King Henry III of England, around about 1220. His division is the one you find in your own Bible today. He usually started a new chapter where the Hebrew text began a new paragraph, but he was not overly fastidious. He tried to keep chapters within certain bounds, 30 to 50 verses as they would come to be known, but the division was convenience only. Take the book of Job, a book of long speeches. For no good reason at all, Langton divided one of Job's speeches into chapters 6 and 7, where logic dictated be a single chapter. In a few other places, he disregarded the more logical Jewish paragraph system and placed his chapter divisions a few sentences before or after the Hebrew divisions. After Langton, the Bible was divided into chapters, but not into verses. For the Old Testament, that seems to have been done by Rabbi Isaac Nathan, who lived in Spain in the early 1400s. He accepted Langton's chapter divisions, but wanted a better way to engage with his Christian opponents, and so devised a system where he could accurately identify almost every sentence in the Tanakh. In the Jewish tradition, the chapter and verse divisions were entrenched in the first great Hebrew printed Bible, the Great Scriptures, published in Italy in 1518. They are included in most printed versions of the Tanakh, but never in the synagogue scrolls. Conservative Jews grudgingly accept the divisions, admitting that there is no actual prohibition against their use. They are simply too convenient to ignore, but they prefer that in their printed Bibles the chapter and verse divisions be relegated to marginal annotations. The New Testament was only divided into verses by the French printer Robert Estienne in 1550. The first English language Bible to use both chapters and verses was the Geneva Bible in 1560. This was created by dissident English Protestants hiding out in Switzerland during the reign of Queen Mary. The Geneva Bible was the version preferred by the more radical Protestants. Years after the King James Bible had been published, the Puritans preferred the Geneva Bible and took it to America. English-language Jewish Bibles changed the chapter and verse numbers from Christian Bibles in some places. Most of the changes are in the Book of Psalms. Where Christian Bibles do not count the psalm title as a verse, the Jewish Bibles count it as verse 1. The other 100 changes usually bring the verse numbering into alignment with the traditional Hebrew paragraph system. In the next episode of History in the Bible, we can really start our tour of Genesis. I'll see you then.